Hello and welcome to this fourth class of the Protein Engineering course based on artificial intelligence. And this time, we're going to review the algorithms that are behind the artificial intelligence revolution, which are actually the language models based on the transformer architecture. Remember that this is the fourth class of a total of 10 classes that make up this course, which is completely free and is available on YouTube so you can delve deeper into each of these topics. And before starting class, the announcement is that the images, quotes, as well as recommended literature for each specific topic that is being addressed, as you will find them in the notes section on each of the slides. So for more information about the course, please check its official website. Likewise, I invite you to review the repository on GitHub, where you will be able to find tools, databases, as well as other courses related, for example, to transformers or other neural network architectures. To be able to download the slides and access the information, as well as adapt it to a course you are developing, you can do it from either of these two platforms, which is Inodo or Google Drive. If you want to ask a question, please leave it here in the comments box, or you can send it to me on one of my social networks, where you can find me as the user at my hangar. And if you find this course productive for your professional development, you can make a financial donation via PayPal in the following link. So, let's see what topics we're going to cover in this particular class. There are 4 major topics, and first, we are going to review what can be called a language model. As a second topic, we will address what the architecture of the transformer is and the variants it has had throughout these years, which are relatively few and research in this world has really exploded. As a third topic, we will evaluate how well these algorithms perform in their predictions, and obviously if they are generating a generalization with the data it was trained on, data that was not used during training. And finally, we will talk about how we currently work with this type of language models, what types of libraries are used, or what techniques are implemented to be able to work with models that are increasingly larger and that require great computational demand. So let's get started. What are language models? To do this, we must understand that within this area, which is known as the area of natural language processing, there are many algorithms that are dedicated to being able to understand, interpret, or generate human language, something that precisely allows us to communicate ideas, and that has been like one of the pillars of our civilization. And for this, natural language modeling covers many categories. For example, you have some of them, but they are not necessarily all, but rather as a brief summary of what each one could be, such as multilinguality in other cases such as text generation, learning to generate summaries, paraphrasing, generating code, among many other aspects that precisely the diversity of the language and each of its tasks has, which is precisely what we seek to analyze in order to be executed by algorithms. And for this, obviously, before the existence of transformer-type architectures, we had specific algorithms for each of these tasks. And what is known as the no-free lunch theorem had even been proposed, at least in its variant applied to what is supervised learning, which practically what it suggests to us is that, well, there is no algorithm that is capable of addressing each of all these problems, and in general these programs really achieve a precision, a quality that is relatively good. That is, they are equivalent. There is no solution capable of addressing all of these problems in a single algorithm. And this was very funny because in 2017, this article was presented that obviously changed. Well, the modern civilization called attention is all you need, which is attention is all you need. An article that was very humbly presented by its authors at the most famous conferences in the world of artificial intelligence, such as the NeurIPS, and since 2007 to the present day, this article has already accumulated around 200,000 citations, which at least within the world of science is something enormous. And in this article, the most relevant thing that is presented, and that is really the cause of the current revolution, is the architecture of transformer-type neural networks, which as you can see has two large main modules, one that is an encoder that learns to precisely compress all this information, and then a decoder that decompresses it to be able to predict in this sense, that they use this algorithm to be able to carry out translations between languages, such as Spanish to English, German to French, among many other things. However, within this algorithm, its core, its heart, is precisely an operation that draws attention. Here, as you can see, what the encoder and decoder module really is. It has multiple elements that we are going to review in detail in the following slides. But precisely, what makes the transformer the transformer is the operation of voltage. An operation that does have its mathematical formulation, and that we are obviously going to address in equal detail in the following slides. And it really was a revolution, because the transformers practically permeated almost all areas of what the algorithm was. Here are examples of what computer vision is: transformer, natural language processing, transformer, learning by effort, transformer, speech, transformer, translation, transformer, science or graph theory, transformer. In virtually any area of algorithm, a transformer is the one that is currently leading as the best performing algorithm at its particular task. And this is quite interesting. How does an algorithm really have these abilities to make very, very, very good predictions? So, as a brief summary of how this architecture works, here we are going to address it in an extremely summary way. In principle, a transformer is based on its ability to include multiple data, disintegrating it such as text, image, audio or video, or any other type of data that is included, since we can also include it within this type of algorithms. They are quite generalists. And then, what we start from is, now if we are using a sequence of text, such as an amino acid sequence of a protein, we create a vocabulary that is represented by units known as tokens. If, for example, in a protein we have around 20 proteinogenic amino acids, then we have 20 tokens, one token for each residue or type of amino acid itself. So instead of representing the sequence as a set of characters that would be those behind the alphabet, we represent them as numerical values, 1, 2, 3, up to 20. And remember, in this case, each one of them is a token, and together, well, they represent a vocabulary. But the same thing can happen with an image that, well, we practically segment it into small segments, and then we also assign each one to a token. This then is also explored further below. We can still segment the audio by intervals, and that is tokenized. And even the video, which we can also represent as a series of images over time, since it can also be tokenized. Here the idea is how to fragment all possible inputs through a vocabulary made up of tokens. Once we have these tokens, they will now be represented in a high dimensionality thanks to a neural network where, actually, what would be the token number 7 is now represented, for example, by a series of vectors, well, a vector that contains many numbers that can be of a dimension that in this case is 1024, or it can be 768 or 512. The joke is that it is raised to a high dimension so that the algorithm learns to decrypt all the information and be able to store it in this type of vectors, and thus obviously obtain representations rich in information. And once we have precisely these vectors that are also known as embeddings, now we actually execute the mathematical operation that I showed you previously that is known as attention. And let's say that one way a diagram represents this operation is practically to do as a free-for-all. What we do is represent it as if it were a graph where, well, practically what is done is to calculate how important this embedding is in relation to all the others in order to make the predictions. And then the model learns to autonomously detect which are the most relevant words, the most relevant sections of an image or audio in order to precisely make its predictions. And this is precisely something that the model learns by itself, and does not always have to be indicated by us. Learn information that is properly the context of the phrase or the semanticity of the whole. And finally, it uses precisely this contextual richness to be able to make its predictions, which in this case is simply a meow and an egg emoji. Which doesn't make much sense, but it may be an answer in a specific case. This is how transformers work in a very brief way. Next, we will explore in detail how this architecture works. First, we must talk about what is known as a language model, something that had been proposed since approximately the 70s. And since it really is not something so complicated to understand properly, a language model is that model that is represented by a probabilistic distribution that precisely models sequences of words from the word W1, W2 to WN in this case. And yet there is diversity in these language models regarding how they precisely decompose the joint probability that is present between these words. To model them in this sense. For example, what current language models do is predict a joint distribution in this case of the token that follows a word that is the most probable. And once this probability distribution has been modeled, it is then sampled in order to generate the output. In this case, what we have is an example that the child was A, so through training, the transformer autonomously learns to associate this set of words with what would be the most likely response, given all this context. So based on this, it is most likely that the child went to the playground after recess. But it could also be to the hospital in case he included other information prior to this sentence that suggested that that's where things are going, right? That is to say, what the language models are really modeling is a probability distribution of all this text to be able to later show it, and thus choose one of the tokens that would follow, or in this case, words. But these are the modern ones, really the language models because, as I mentioned, they have been around since the 70s and multiple variants have been explored, and they have not really been so effective until now. For example, there are some language models that are considered classic, which practically what they did is model the language in a very frequentist way. In this sense, they simply considered products between words or equal conditional probabilities of the previous words. Until perhaps very sophisticated algorithms arrived, which are hidden Markov models, models that really exist in the world of computing. They are very popular, they are very famous, they are highly appreciated for their high degree of optimization during inference, and what really stands out is for using something known as hidden variables, which are practically a type of variables that the model learns to adjust autonomously in itself, and that in itself, really, these types of hidden Markov models have been used practically for any type of problem, which is even usually associated with the fact that actually solving almost any problem could be interpreted as being able to find a suitable Orcut Markov model. We have even been able to adapt from the world of bioinformatics to be able to generate tools similar to what BLAST would be, this tool that helps us compare protein sequences, which in this case, HAMER is built precisely on this type of Orcut Markov model algorithms, and that are obviously also used to generate protein databases, such as this one called PFAM, which helps us organize the millions of proteins that we have into the most common families, which are detected precisely thanks to hidden Markov models. And currently, well, now we have language models that are now based on neural networks. The first language model that were based on this type of algorithms, well, it could be this one called word embedding, where the most relevant thing about this model is being able to associate what would be a prediction with a context window of the sequence that you are trying to model. A little bit of semanticity began to be injected into it, but evidently not as much, because perhaps the algorithm simply did not allow for that much. Until precisely the transformers arrived, which, as you see here, each one has a mathematical representation of how the language is modeled in each case. And in this case, the modern language models based on transformers, let's say that we can measure them in two large categories, some that are generative and others that are masked. That in this case, in order to make a prediction of a particular word, it depends on all the words that preceded it to be able to precisely make the prediction. Or that in the case of masked language models, all the words must be considered, which in this case could be precisely the word wi, but then all of them must be considered except for it, as you can see here in the indices of each of these words in order to make the predictions. And evidently, these types of language models based on transformer are behind the type of revolutionary algorithms such as ChatGPT, such as AlphaFold, among multiple other AIs that currently exist. And precisely what makes transformers so general. And this is something that is explored in this preprint, which suggests to us that they are indeed universal approximators of any function from sequence to sequence, which is a type of function that is very explicit in its name because the literal input is a sequence, and the output that the algorithm has to give is another sequence n. In this case, obviously what the authors suggest here is that these transformers are precisely super good at this type of algorithms, and that their success is due to the multiple elements that make up the architecture of the transformer, such as the positional coding, the operation of the tension, the inclusion of multi-layer perceptrons, as well as being able to include contextual information from this that we extracted when performing the all-against-all comparison, and that is precisely the context that it provides to the algorithm to be able to make the predictions. What does it mean, then, that it is a sequence-to-sequence function? Well, we are practically talking about probability distributions. Let's say that. In this case, we are talking about a probability distribution that can represent these two sets of images relatively well, which would be fruits and animals. In this case, let's say, we are looking for how similar, from what is understood from the semantics of these words, they are most similar to each other. So like the emojis here of the fruits, we can ask this probability distribution. Which of these fruit makes a banana or makes a strawberry? Well, it is more similar to the kiwi. And obviously, since they are fruits, they are, let's say, within that category, since they are assigned a greater probability compared to the other category, such as, for example, they could be animals, which are obviously not fruits. And then the transformer learns to fit a probability distribution that has explanatory capabilities that divide these two categories of words, which is relatively quite similar to what this probability distribution would be that we learned autonomously throughout our lives, and which helps us to distinguish that perhaps some words are associated with one category compared to others. Really, what we are talking about when we say these types of functions are probability distributions. Everything is based on probability distributions. So once we understand this about what the models are, language models, let's explore how the transformer architecture works. And obviously this is something that is going to be relatively dense, so take your time. You can reproduce it as many times as you want and then let's go. Before starting with that, obviously you have to know the ancestors of the transformer and what things inspired or took the transformer from them to be so good at his predictions. One of the first inspirations that transformer-type architecture takes, and which is perhaps the clearest, are recurrent neural networks. A type of neural networks that were adapted to be able to precisely model the text sequentially, and that in this case made use of what is known as a hidden memory, where they evidently considered previous stages of the network in order to make their predictions. And in this case, this mechanism implemented by recurrent neural networks was now replaced by the attention operation. Likewise, by being able to recover part of the context of the previous words, some context of the entire phrase was modeled, but not the entire phrase. So we were talking about a context. Well, very local, but perhaps not so global. But at the end of the day, it was context. And again, this mechanism, which is based on hidden states, was replaced by the operation of tension. As a second inspiration, and very obviously, we have the encoder-decoder type architecture, where in this case, precisely as we addressed in the previous class, this type of neural networks exist. Precisely requires representing in a very information-rich way this bottleneck represented by a lower dimensionality compared to what would be the input or output layer. That is, to represent the content of all our inputs as best as possible, or as rich as possible, in order to be able to extract obviously good predictions from there. And in this case, what would be the architecture of the autoencoder? Well, practically, it only has one latent space that would be this bottleneck. Now it is represented in the transformer by something known as the head attention modules, or multi-head attention in English. And also a relevant thing within this autoencoder architecture is that, as you can see, there is relatively no explicit communication between the encoder part and the decoder part. And that in this case with the transformer, there is this type of communication between these two modules explicitly through another variant of the voltage operation called cross-voltage. And finally, we talk about RedNets, a neural network architecture that is relatively simple, which practically is to be able to make the predictions we take, the previous values of the neurons, so as not to lose it throughout the sequence of layers, and thus the original information does not fade away throughout the process, especially when we are talking about architectures that are super deep and have thousands of neurons. And in this case, what ResNets allow, residual networks, is that by using these residual connections, we can establish gradients that are much more stable, which translates into better training. And that also translates into an ability to be able to include more and more layers, which obviously allows us to avoid the problem that we had of the gradient vanishing or the gradient exploiting due to its high numbers, and that simply the convergence to some solution in the lost landscape cannot precisely be found during the optimization process. These would be, at least from my personal perspective, like the great main sources of inspiration that the transformer took, although it evidently took many others, but they help us understand what the transformer is doing. So this is the anatomy of the transformer. Let's see what happens in each of these specific modules. As you can see, here we start from a hello world, and the task is to predict it to its equivalent in English, which is a hello world. And to do this, what is done is to pass all this information, learn a representation rich in information, that is, an embedding, and this embedding will be passed to the next module, which is the decoder, so that it now learns to relate, but in this case we mask the other word of hello world. In this case we mask world, and we do precisely this injection of information to this module. And now the decoder module has to be able to decode with the information from the encoder. What word would be missing to be able to precisely predict hello world? And as you can see, there are multiple components and we are going to review them all, each one of them, very briefly here and then in detail below. As a first step, what we get here is the input embedding. That is, we have to generate a representation that is vector and has fixed dimensions. As we talked about, he has to generate a vocabulary where each word can be represented with a token, and that token is now represented with an embedding, taking it to a high dimension. And this is precisely what happens in the input embedding layer. As a second element, we now have what is known as positional encoding, where the positional position is now added to each of these embeddings of a complete phrase that we are using. In this case, let's say there are only two positions in our phrase hello world, so we have to add that information of what word is the first position, the second position, or the third position in positions, so that precisely the model learns to detect well which words go in what order as the fourth element. Now we have precisely the stellar operation of the transformer, which is precisely the voltage. That what it allows us to do is identify the relationships that exist between tokens, and that this precisely allows us to extract the contextual information from the phrase itself. Here, as you can see, there are also other operations that are practically an addition, and they perform a norm that practically normalizes what our vectors are. Well, practically what helps us is to stabilize the training and ensure that some solution converges faster and does not become saturated, whether the gradient explodes or fades away. Now here, as you can see in the diagram, what these little arrows are precisely the skip connections, these residual connections, which ensure that the initial information is not lost. But it is also combined with the information that is generated throughout the algorithm, so that the input does not fade away and be forgotten. And now we have what feed-forward networks are, which are practically types of neural networks of the multi-layer perceptron type. They are not complex, and what they simply do is precisely model nonlinearity, because until now no element of the transformer has actually performed nonlinear operations, and what it does now is take all this aggregate of information that has been executed throughout all these algorithms and now it executes precisely the operation that we already reviewed in the deep learning class, where activation functions are used to model nonlinearity. And as a result, we now have an embedding, something rich in information, that is capable of representing each of these words in a high-dimensional vector. And this output embedding can even be used in other subsequent tasks, such as classification tasks, regression or clustering tasks, in order to find a certain structure in our data. And that will depend on what the training process has also been, and obviously, if it was trained well. It means that our embedding includes the semantic information of the entire sentence. This output embedding can now also be used by the decoder. No more than in this case. Now let's look at how the decoder works precisely. Again, then now we have another second phrase that is equivalent to English, such as hello, except that this time we are not going to show you the complete input. Now let's disturb the input. In this case, we are not going to show you what word is and what is going to be used here. It is what is known as a mask, which is a way of hiding the information so that the model then makes an effort to detect which word would be the most appropriate to be able to hear it. Solve the question that we are asking. In this case, it would be hello world, but in this case, the model does not know that word. Again, it is passed through an input embedding layer through a positional encoding, and here in this case, what is? Attention is used, but in this case masked, which by disturbing the tokens that we have precisely strives to decrypt the relationships between words, and thus detect precisely which ones would be appropriate to be able to make the prediction. Then we have another variant of attention that includes the information learned during the encoder and is now used within the decoder to be able to relate what would be. Let's say, in this particular example, the language of Spanish with the language of English. Although in reality, we are talking more about relating the encodings learned by the encoder and the decoder, in this particular case. And finally, we continue with all the algorithms that we previously reviewed, such as add norm and another feed-forward layer. And finally, we move on to what is a relatively simple network, which is just a linear layer. There are no activation functions there. It is simply used to adjust what would be this high-dimensional embedding to what would be the values of the vocabulary itself, which would be the number of tokens. And then we go through an activation function that would be a softmax to obtain the probabilities of each of these tokens, which we can interpret as a token, a word, and which in this case teaches us to predict the token worth as the most probable because it was related throughout the training process as an equivalent to hello world. So once we have seen very briefly how the architecture of the transformer works, we are going to review it in detail so that it is super clear. Well, as I mentioned, in the input embedding layer, what happens is the representation of what our words would be through a vocabulary, which in this case we are using the word this as an example. In this case, we divide the phrase by each of the letters that constitute it. A token, in this case one token goes to this, another goes to this, and so on to all the examples including even the period. And then, for each of these tokens, we now have a numerical representation. Because as you know, any algorithm doesn't really understand words, it understands numbers. So anything, if it's a protein, if it's an image, if it's a video, we have to find a numerical representation to be able to operate on it, which in this case are simply IDs that are associated with a vocabulary. And this vocabulary, evidently, has its own particular characteristics, such as how big it is, how expressive it is, whether or not it can cover fewer words from multiple languages, whether it is very efficient in its way of containing information, among many other questions that we can ask ourselves when designing a vocabulary that may be capable of representing the diversity of data that we want to represent. But in this case, maybe we don't. We complicate life a lot. In fact, vocabularies are also another type of algorithms that are also usually learned autonomously, but we do not cover that so much here. But we simply, let's say, select as many words, whether we have, I don't know, in the English language or in the Spanish language, and then we generate a vocabulary that in this case could be this one, presented by 1, 2, or 3, but perhaps there could be vocabularies of up to millions, right? That will depend precisely on the design of the algorithm when you are training a transformer. And now what happens is that once we have these representations with ID tokens, we now have to pass them precisely to high-dimensional vector representations. And this is obtained through the embedding layer, which is precisely a neural network that takes each of these ID tokens and now represents them as high-dimensional vectors, as you can see here, which in this case, let's say, are only 3 dimensions, but they can be thousands of dimensions. And subsequently, all the other algorithms that we previously reviewed already occur. Here you can see how different modern language models based on transformer-type neural networks tokenize the phrase "nothing in biology makes sense" into light of, and an emoji of a light bulb. As you can see, some tokenizers associated with each of these models, well, they do it in a very different way. For example, tokenizers of the BERT type model include a special type of token. Here also the GEMA model includes another type of special token. What would be the cloud model, Llama or GPT-4, all of them tokenize the word noting as a single word. But as you can see, there is a very considerable variation regarding how each of them tokenizes the text. And that evidently corresponds to the algorithm behind the design of the entire architecture. And the tokenization part is super important. It is also a personal consideration, part of the heart of the transformer. And even here there are some suggestions from Andres Carpati about the relevance of the tokenization process. Because tokenization lies many of the problems that these types of models have when making their predictions. So it even suggests what the root of all suffering is. Well, it is tokenization. Why can't current language models be trained in an easier way than a random forest or an XGBoost? Well, it is tokenization too. Why are language models bad at being able to perform arithmetic operations due to tokenization? Why isn't it translated correctly when we can? Changing between languages such as English or Japanese is tokenization. Tokenization is behind all the problems because, as you can see, it is the representation capacity that the algorithm has of all the diversity of data that you want to model. And then here you can see an example of how different languages are tokenized to each of them, since they obviously correspond more or less to the token, than in this case in Spanish. Let's say we can take as an example the dog eats the apples, and as you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tokens, which if we translated it into English, we are talking about only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tokens. We are talking about 3 less tokens, but when we now talk about the Chinese language, the representation, there is different from how we handle it here in the West, because it turns out that now we need 3 tokens to represent the same idea. As you can see, languages also have a different representation seen from tokenization, which also goes hand in hand with the ability to extract the semantic context of all words. And therefore, it is consistent with what Andrzej Karpathyk suggested, that the root of all the suffering of language model developers is due to the tokenization process. When, for example, we think about tokenization in the world of proteins, we can think about how we represent a protein. And as you know, there are multiple representations for this type of biological object, such as a multiple alignment of sequences, or even the single sequence itself. We can represent a protein as a cloud of points. We can represent it by its surface, at a volumetric level, by its contact maps. More geometric representations, such as Voronoi alterations, could be. We can represent them as graphs, as networks between receipts at a certain contact threshold, or by their content of secondary structures. So you observe that really thinking about what form is most useful for our task, representing our data, really determines what the behavior of our transformer will be, which is precisely why the tokenization process is so important. For example, when we review the AlphaFold 2 algorithm, which we actually explore in detail in a complete class, we can see that there are 2 main transforms that make up the entire algorithm. One is called a waveformer, and the other is called structural module. And in order to represent a multiple alignment of sequences, that is, protein sequences, what AlphaFold uses in total is 23 tokens. 20 tokens are associated with proteinogenic amino acids. A token is used to indicate those for which we do not know which residue it corresponds to. Another token is used to model what the gaps are in the alignment. And another token, which is a special token to indicate which residue is now going to be masked, so that we can learn to predict precisely what atomic position would correspond to it. In this case, there are only 23 tokens for a model that revolutionized protein science. It is quite interesting how even with a vocabulary of only 23, we can achieve great results. But in another case, such as the protein language model called ESM3, includes a tokenization that is much more diverse, given that they are considering as inputs for their model what a protein sequence is. They are also considering the structure. They are considering its secondary structure, its percentage of exposure of the surface to the solvent. They are even modeling text associated with its functions. For example, if it is a catalase, a hydrolase, among many other things. And if each of these residues is flagged as, for example, a residue that is catalytic, a residue that is binding, a residue that is hydrophobic, that is information that they are also adding to the model. As you can see, the SM3 protein language model is modeling multiple modalities, both text and information associated with what the protein is, which makes it much more complex. For example, to be able to represent only what a structure is through tokens, they trained an autoencoder that is capable of representing it in a reasonable dimensionality that preserves the information of all the structures. And it turns out that the tokenizer that they trained represents the structures with approximately 4096 tokens plus another 4 special ones for the world of protein structures. But in order to model protein sequences, it uses the 20 tokens that are also used here in AlphaFold, but it also uses 4 special tokens for the rarest amino acids, like selenocysteine and that kind of thing, and other tokens apart, which in total, together with all the other tokens for the other modalities, add up to something like 7,000 tokens that represents its vocabulary, which obviously entails a much more complicated training process. And that obviously falls within the entire research and development process to be able to train this type of algorithms. So, once we explore what the tokenization process is, we move on to the next step, which is adding the position. Information of what each of the words is in the complete phrase, and for this, a combination of sine and cosine is used, which is quite interesting. We can even think artistic. Here what we have is the representation of a word from these embeddings. So this embedding corresponds to this one, love. This other embedding corresponds to it, tennis, this other embedding. And the point is also modeled by an embedding, by a high-dimensional vector, such as 1024 or 512. To these vectors, we must add the information that has the position of this phrase, I love tennis. This is position 1, this is position 2, position 3, and position 4. And in order to add the information, these two formulas are used where I is the embedding index, as it could be, I don't know, if you have an embedding with a dimensionality of 512. Well, then you have from 0 to 511 possible positions. Right. Where for positions that are even the sine is used. For positions that are odd the cosine is used. And then now in these embeddings an update is added precisely through this operation that now informs the model what its relative position is with respect to all the other words. And this when we observe it when graphing it, that in this case on the x-axis we are seeing the dimensionality of the embedding, for example, 128, as well as the position of the words in a particular phrase, as it could be here in this brief example. I love Dennis because it keeps me strong and healthy. Although in reality there are few words compared to the total of 50, since we can see that what is positional coding forms this interference pattern typical of wave modeling, which derives precisely from the dynamics of sine and cosine. And this is how the transformer is added or informed about the position of a word in the entire phrase that we intend to model. Currently, this encoding that was used in the original transformer may have already fallen into disuse. Since it is not as optimal, it does not scale as well when we train extremely large models. And what is currently used is a geometric approach called rope, which is rotary position embedding, where precisely we work from a geometric perspective, where we rotate the embeddings in this high dimensionality, and through calculations related to linear algebra and all this type of things, we can inform the model how they relate to their positions. No more than this, obviously we do not address it, since we are explaining the classic architecture of the transformer. So now we explore how embeddings are generated, how the position of each of the words within the complete phrase is informed. And now we move on to the stellar operation, which is attention. In this case, we are talking about that in this embedding space, each of our words, or let's say emojis, or any type of information that you want to model. What we want is for our model to learn to generate an information-rich representation, capable of distinguishing information categories from other information categories. So we go here for example of a two-dimensional map, where these emojis are distributed almost in a random way, and now through what is the attention procedure. The model must be able to distinguish that these emojis are usually associated with fruits, and these emojis are usually associated with animals. And this obviously has to be learned independently. The idea is that precisely a vector representation rich in contextual information is learned that even allows us to operate with these embeddings. For example, what would be the location of the embeddings that represent the word king and queen are together in that space, given that they correspond, let's say, to a category that we could relate to kingdoms, and that the embeddings that represent the word man and woman are in another space within that vector space, and that, evidently, are made relatively similar to each other, which corresponds to what the sex of the people would be. But we can even perform operations with this type of embeddings, if they are rich in contextual information. So that if I have the embedding that represents what the word king would be, I subtract the embedding that represents the word man, but I add the embedding that represents the word woman. Its equivalent would be what it would be for a queen. Since the model understands the context, and then by removing the man from the crown, now the model knows that we are talking about a queen. This occurs during the training process where we have multiple categories that are all overlapping at the beginning, and the model has to be able to, through contextual mapping of all against all relationships, autonomously detect those categories that could be associated because they are more similar to each other. This is something that all transformers learn, and they learn it in a particular way in each case. For this, we must understand precisely what happens in the operation of attention and what we are talking about when we say attention. Attention is practically the meaning of that for a word. Really determining what the meaning of a word is depends on its entire context. Because even in an entire sentence, when changing a comma, when changing a position of a word within the sentence, it can completely change what it means in total. And here we have two very clear examples. In this case, we're talking about growing a bacterial culture in the laboratory, but it is in English. And in the other example, we are talking about culture affects human behavior. As you can see, the central word here is culture, which due to its context within the phrase as a whole, is meaning something completely different. In the first sentence, we are talking about bacterial cultures, bacteria and laboratories. And in the same example, we are talking about culture, the relationships between people, the context in which they were born, their language. And obviously culture, although it is one word, means completely different things due to the context of all the other words that are included within the phrase. Therefore, when we associate, let's say what would be the most important word within this sentence in relation to the word culture. In this sentence, we could think that it is bacteria, and in this other example it could be human. When we ask what the second most important word would be, well, in this case it would be laboratory, or in this case it could be behavior. And so the idea is that attention allows us to extract the semantic part of all phrases to give a meaning to a word, based precisely on its entire context. When we think about what it represents at the level of a protein, perhaps we could think that they are important interactions. For example, here what we observe is a sequence of amino acids in a protein, where, as you know, what cysteine residues are can be quite important because they can establish interactions of the type of disulfide bridges. So perhaps during training of the protein language model, the model learns that these residues are relevant since they are establishing these types of bridges. This can also be reflected, for example, in when we look at the three-dimensional structure of the protein and then look at which residues are in a neighborhood around a particular residue that we look at, and that perhaps they are establishing ion dipole type interactions or hydrogen bonds, any other type of molecular interaction that is relevant. And even when we really turn to analyze what these types of protein language models represent, such as the residues with the greatest tension among themselves, here the tension is represented by these orange bars. It is quite interesting to observe that these models, despite having been trained only with protein sequences, assign greater attention between residues that are in contact in the three-dimensional structure. What this means is that despite only using sequence information, It seems that protein language models learn to detect which residues are in contact in the three-dimensional structure, which was never indicated from the beginning, since you only worked with sequences. And they not only learn to detect which residues are in contact in the three-dimensional structure, but they also detect which residues could be the most relevant to be able to perform their function in the event that it is done. A binding site, a catalytic site, which in this case here is represented by a protease, where what you see is that multiple residues are now mapping a lot of tension, particularly this residue that actually matches one of the catalytic residues for this particular protease, which is actually quite interesting because again, at no point was the model indicated that this residue is performing this type of catalytic activity, but by observing thousands of proteins, because it detected that this residue is quite relevant for something in particular. And now, it is our turn to investigate what makes that residue receive so much tension from all the other residues that make up the protein. So now, we are going to understand what this whole operation of what tension is really. And for this, I like to start from an analogy with what multiple databases are, because the process of calculating tension uses things that perhaps for us who are trained in the world of biological sciences, we are not as familiar as they could be vectors that are called query key and values, and that these are really the ones that are used to calculate the tension at a mathematical level, because when we talk about tension, as a concept, it is quite clear to us what semantic information is. But how does this translate into algorithmic execution? What is the math like? What is the algorithm necessary to extract semantic information? And for this, we start precisely from what databases are. It's even quite interesting given that Google actually says that its star product is search engines and transformer. Curiously, a company came out of Google that has stellar search algorithms, and that even in an artistic way, it was carried out in the transformer. It was not translated in a way like that. So let's see. We have multiple types of databases, which we can usually associate more easily with our activities would be relational databases. Let's say, although it is not a database itself. For example, Excel tables are relational information in the sense that you have rows and columns, so we each talk about categories and elements that constitute our data set, although Excel is not a database. But let's say that we have that concept more easily associated with our memory. We also have graph-type databases, among many other types of databases. But here the type that is relevant to us to understand how the attention process occurs is the databases called key values. This is quite relevant. Let's see how this type of databases work using Python dictionaries. And this is an analogy, let's put it that way, because it is not so explicit how it happens, but it helps us understand how they happen. This type of database, as you might guess, has two main elements, key and values, which in this case are represented by a dictionary, where what we observe is that here the keys are represented by this string, then a colon follows, and then the values arrive. Then we separate with a comma, and again now we have a key value pair. We also have another key here now. And now we have multiple values for that particular one here. So, for example, this, let's say, could be information that I learned from interacting with my particular crush. And I learned what kind of drinks he likes, what kind of topics he likes to talk about, what kind of food, and even what places to visit when we are in a specific month, such as, if we are in August, well, maybe my crush likes to go to the forest because there are a lot of mushrooms there, and then he likes to do all these types of collections, right? But in December, it will also depend on what type of activity you like to do, right? which in this case is that if it is very hot outside, then now we apply a function. In this case, if the temperature is higher than 20 degrees, then we stay at home or we do go out, right? Here, as you can see, we have a lot of information and it is structured in a key value way, where a key can correspond to multiple values, as we can see here. In this sense, for example, the key associated with drinks is simply simple water, but the key that is associated with all these values has multiple categories that can be multiple types of information. So when I ask it to print the topic's key, what Python returns here is precisely a function like this, which would be a lambda, which is practically a square binomial. Then it prints the number 3.1416 and prints the Euler string. And when I ask him to print me information that is a little more developed, such as the key of places in particular, then I access the month of December and tell it that it is Christmas. The information we have as a result now is a J. So you can see that we nest the information of multiple topics with keywords that are the keys, and that all that information helps us associate it with a particular word. And this is basically how transformers work. In this case, the premise that we can say is part of the attention is all you need article is that a neural network of the transformer type is in itself a key value database that is extremely efficient due to the entire concept it learns, but is still probabilistic. It is not deterministic like the key value databases that we program like the one I program here with this Python dictionary, but rather it is probabilistic. And that precisely operates using keys, keywords, and values, which is the information associated with that keyword, because it is a specific topic, right? However, neural networks don't really know which key they should pay attention to, which one they should look for when we ask them something specific, right? So here we now include a new type of vectors called queries, which are like queries, which must also be learned by the transformer, and which in summary represent what they should be looking for in the relationships with the keys to access their information with the values. This is a third type of vectors that we could associate with this. Let's say, probabilistic database that represents the transformer, and that is now. The transformer must be able to learn query, key, and values to be able to model the information and perform the attention operation. Let's review in more detail what really happens. Here we have a brief example with a protein that, in this case, is a team barrel that has 8 alpha helices, as you can see. This is a fictitious example. It doesn't necessarily mean that this happens, but it helps us understand, which represent the query key and values in terms of proteins. So, as you know, we perturb our input by adding a mask, hiding certain residues from it, and then the encoder and the decoder have to be able to extract relational information that allows us to predict which residue is most likely to be able to replace this mask, right, based on the entire context of the protein. So for this, we are looking precisely for the query, the key, and the values. In this case, queries represent what information you are looking for. In this case, since we are talking about a protein that is a team barrel, we are seeing that it is a protein that integrates elements of alpha and beta secondary structure, and that it is precisely a team barrel. So we are looking for information within these specific categories. Now the key, what does it represent? It is the type of content or the specific topic that is being talked about. For example, it could be the length of the protein sequence, the taxonomy with which this type of protein is associated, E. coli, Pseudomonas, or any other species that you like. Or it could also be the secondary structure content, the type of frequencies. Even if it is a team barrel, there could be other team barrels that do not have frequencies. 8 alpha helices, but rather that they have 10 alpha helices or that they have 6 alpha helices. And now the values that they represent are actually the information that helps us to make predictions, such as in this case it could be that the team barrel that has 8 helices is usually associated with coli, or that this again is fictitious information. This is not necessarily real, but it serves to illustrate in this case how it would operate with proteins. Then as a second example, we have that the alpha helices of the team barrels of Escherichia coli are usually rich in alanine, leucine, and lysine residues. And we even have more specific information, which is that at the next residue of an alanine residue, we usually find one that is leucine. So based on all this information that the transformer could find by searching from categories, finding them through their keys, we found this information to be relevant to us to be able to say that in this mask it is most likely that a leucine residue is the one that should go here. And so it would be like this fictional example of how this process of searching for information works that really had to be learned by the transformer itself. Now let's actually look at how it happens algorithmically. Once the positional information has been added to each of the embeddings in our particular phrase, now we go on to represent these input embeddings with some matrices that are properly the queries matrices, the keys matrices, and the values matrices that are really neural networks that must learn to represent the information appropriately to be able to include all this contextual information, and that by being able to operate this input embedding and multiply it, it will give us the result. A vector that is now the key vector, a query vector, and a value vector. That is, for each input embedding that we have, now we are going to have 3 vectors, and each of them represents the query, the key, and the value. As you can see here, we are really not just modeling a single word, but in this case, we are modeling "I love tennis" and a period. So we're modeling 4 words at a time. So then, actually, when we use this neural network or this matrix, we are really going through multiple inputs, and this is known as the context window, which is like the number of words or tokens, properly speaking, that are being processed in a single stroke during this process of extracting the contextual information from the tokens. So, if we are passing 4 input embeddings to this operation, well, now we are going to have 4, so it would be 4, 8, and 12 vectors in total, and each one, as I mentioned, has to be a query, a key vector, and a value vector, with which we are now going to proceed to perform even more operations. Here what you see is the encoder module. The encoder itself is also organized in multiple layers. There are up to 12 layers, 36 layers, 48 layers, all of that will depend precisely on the engineering behind the development of the algorithm, and that precisely the main layers will pass the information to the last layers in order to learn representations that are increasingly rich in information. And so now we observe that we precisely have the query, key, and values vectors with which we are going to have to operate in order to calculate the tension. What really happens in each of these layers of the transformer, particularly of the encoder, is that we operate with these query key values through an attention module, and that this attention module also has multiple heads. That is, multiple times in which the attention is calculated in a different way so that they learn different concepts and obviously learn to relate the information in a richer way, and that this way it can be precisely extracted a relevant meaning to be able to make predictions. Strictly speaking, for each of these attention heads that we have here, as I remember, a layer of the encoder in turn has multiple attention heads, and in each of the attention heads this procedure occurs where we have the query and keys. Vectors first go through an operation called the scalar product or the dot product. This scalar product is a very recurring operation within linear algebra and practically helps us approximate what the similarity between two vectors would be in a specific vector space. As you can see here, we have two vectors A and B, and in this case, what it gives us is values from -1 to 1. When the dot product of two vectors is close to 1, we are seeing that they are usually associated with the same direction in the vector space, and then we can say that they are relatively similar to each other. But when the dot product gives us something related to or close to -1, we are talking about vectors that are nothing like each other. So in this case, let's say we stopped it here, and a dot product value of 0.95 came out. So we're talking about two vectors that in the vector space, they are relatively similar, and therefore let's say that we are going to be able to extract more information from them with respect to two vectors that have values of -97, and that then the information that they can extract from their relationships may not be as relevant during the learning process. Subsequently, what we do are other types of operations, which are to scale them, such as normalize them. In this case, it is optional whether you are modeling with a mask or not. And we pass it through a nonlinear activation function, which is the submax. And again, we apply a scalar product again. Now considering the vector's values. As you can see here in this other diagram. Here we start again from what the embeddings are for each of the words. For each of these embeddings, query key values vectors are obtained. Through the multiplication of these matrices, remember that they are neural networks themselves. And then we come to this procedure that we already reviewed previously, which is precisely the calculation between keys and queries, which is the same one we are observing here. We apply the dot product and arrive at this type of maps. And to this type of maps, now again here we pass it through this submax activation function, and these new attention values are known as auto-tension, which is precisely the importance between pairs of words in our particular sentence. Self-tension is really like the second heart within transformer architecture, because it precisely allows us to associate which words are most important with each other. And so now what these self-tensions do is go through a scalar product again to do more operations again and arrive at a representation of embeddings that is now updated with the semantic information. As I mentioned, these self-attention maps tell us what the relevance is between pairs of words. So here, for example, we can explore what attention is paid by word pairs in layer number 1, in attention head number 1. And we're going to use the example that we have been using, which is I love tennis. In particular, here this language model that I used represents I love tennis, but is represented in this particular way, here by adding two cat symbols. And what we observe is that the attention values in this case are actually asymmetric. That is, when we stop here at the attention that the word love is paying with respect to the word I. In this case, it is 0.16, but when we stop from the word I to the word love, in this case the tension is 0.29. And this is due precisely to the training process, where precisely in one sentence we can find love in multiple contexts, as well as I in multiple contexts. And then this symmetrical tension is due precisely to this procedure, where each of these words actually has the contextual information. So what we find is that in this sense, in layer number 1, in tension head number 1, the most important word associated with I is love. The second word would be I, the third word would be 10, and the fourth word would be this is love. And this is quite relevant given that this pattern was learned on the specific tension head and cape combination. But what the transformer does is include what is known as multi-head attention or multiple voltage modules, multiple voltage heads, where as you can see on the y-axis we have what are the encoder layers, and on the x-axis what are the voltage heads. And then each of them is responsible for learning specific patterns that help predict the function. Some may focus on different semantic contexts or different patterns, but the idea here is that they learn in a very diverse way to extract the contextual meaning of words, as you can see from the diversity of patterns that exist. So once we have reviewed this self-attention process and how this diversity occurs through multiple heads of attention, through multiple layers of the encoder, what we have as a product is a little vector. And we must also understand this little vector, what dimensionality it has, and what it represents, because it would really be the output of this specific module, of a particular attention head. If we are working with 12 tension heads, we should have 12 such vectors. Now let's see below how this relates to the dimensionality of the embedding. Using as an example, what would be the language model called BERT. BERT in particular uses an embedding dimensionality of 768. And in their heads of tension, it considers only 12. This is relevant information since it evidently determines the dimensionality of this embedding. What we have here is that when we divide the dimensionality of the embedding by the number of tension heads, we have a value of 64. That is, this little vector of 64 that is represented, or that is represented by multiplying the embedding by the query or keys or values matrix, must be 64 dimensions. So now we have keys vectors, values vectors, queries vectors that have a dimension of 64. And what is the tension operation that is defined by these query matrices, key matrices and values matrices, is really represented as this submax, where this product is made between the query matrix and the transposed matrix of the key. Matrices and all this has to be multiplied in turn. For this dimensionality of what the keys are, which, as we already calculated right now, is 768 divided by 12, for this particular example, which is BERT, which is 64. And then when calculating this quotient now, we are going to calculate the product of this or the resulting value, which is the values of the value matrices. And then now if we have to, if in this case BERT uses 12 heads of attention, then we have 12 vectors of this type, and now what happens at this level is that they have to be concatenated, and eventually they are passed through another linear neural network that simply adds information, so that now, if we have 12 vectors each of 64 dimensions and we add them, we have a final vector representation of 768 dimensions, which is the original dimension with which BERT represents the embeddings. So now we understand that for each head of attention, we obtain an embedding of a lower dimension compared to the original embedding, and that they are concatenated and added to arrive precisely at a representation that is now rich in contextual information. Well, as we reviewed, this is what happens when we review what the classic attention operation is, which is multi-head attention. The transformer includes multiple types of attention in order to model the contextual information within a sentence. As you can see here, this is multi-head attention, and here we have another variant which is masked multi-head attention, where what we do is, obviously, hide part of the information so that the model makes an effort to make its predictions and learn from representations that are increasingly rich in information. So how did this translate? We have here the attention matrices that we already reviewed, and so now what we are going to do is add a masking matrix where this masking is represented as values minus infinity, and then now as a result of this operation, it is passed through a submax operation, and we have a matrix where really the model is only paying attention in this case in the word T itself. It has no more prior information here equal to T cake. Oh, take cake was, or take cake was sold. As you can see, we are not accessing all the information that we would have when we are not masking the information, because here in these cases we can access these pairs of words, but in this case, not given that what we want is to hide that information so that the model learns information-rich representations. This type of attention is known precisely as masked or causal attention, given that this causal information of 1, 2, 3, 4 words that give us a context is precisely hidden. And in this case, well no, as you can see, since they are masking what would be cake wasor. And here we have another type of attention, which is multi-head attention. But now it is the multi-head attention that occurs when the information from the encoder to the decoder is communicated. And in this particular case, what we have are the encoder embeddings, and here the decoder embeddings. So in this case, in order to calculate the auto-tension values, what is done is to operate with the query matrices, but that come from the encoder together with the results of the decoder's query matrices. Then the scalar product is done again, passed through a submax function, and we arrive at the crossed attention to the information that he learned in this other language with this other language, and that now, in order to carry out the attention operation, the values of the encoder's value matrices are used to be able to do what is the scalar product and arrive at the representation of the embedding itself. That is, it is a way to communicate with the information learned from the encoder with respect to the decoder. Okay, so now we move on to what happens when we address feed-forward networks that are simply like multi-layer perceptrons. And really this is where, as I mentioned, the nonlinear modeling of this whole thing occurs. And even what feed-forward neural networks are really represent approximately 2/3 of the total parameters that constitute a transformer. The other parameters of the transformer can go to what are the query key values matrices, along with other parameters that help optimize and regularize the training. But in this case, they are quite simple networks that what they do is obviously model the nonlinearity of this whole thing. So if, for example, we use BERT as we had done in previous slides, and BERT has 768 dimensions in its embeddings. What is usually done in these feed-forward neural networks is to quadruple their dimensionality so that they learn to model these contextual relationships in a high dimension in a richer way. And after passing it through this first hidden layer, it is reduced again to the original dimension of the embedding, which is 768 in the case of BERT, but which now includes with this expansion of information a greater meaning of what the contextual information could be. And something that has been seen, and that is quite interesting about how the functionalities of the feed-forward networks can be interpreted within the transformer architecture, is that they really detect patterns of complexity, of semanticity, which evidently become more complex as we advance in the encoder or decoder layers. Here what we observe is that what would be the input layer could be represented as the keys in an analogous way that precisely allow us to detect patterns that would be relevant in a semantic sense, and what would be the hidden layer represent the values where the representations are really skewed by a probability distribution. What does this mean? Well, here what we have is what type of information is learned throughout the layers of a specific transformer. And in this case, the information was classified into different degrees of complexity, such as a very shallow complexity, or one that is medium, which includes medium-shallow information, but also semantic information. An information that is already much more complex, and that we could obviously already say is very semantic, as well as another fourth category that was no longer covered by these authors. And what we observe is that in the first layer of the transformer, information that is very superficial is usually learned, and that as the concepts that the last layers of the transformer progress, more and more semantic concepts are learned. And what does this mean? For example, the type of patterns that could be associated with Sumer-type patterns could be those that all end with the word substitutes. So here we have, 2 weeks later he came off the 2 substitutes. And so we have other examples where they all end with substitutes, substitutes. And as an example of patterns that are semantic, we can see that here there are some that are all those related to TV shows. As could be this one from the original NBC date and version archived. So, when talking about NBC, we are talking about things that are related to TV shows. So, it is interesting that throughout the Transformers architecture, represented by its layers, concepts with a greater degree of complexity are learned. Even through the research that has inspired Transformers-type architecture. Mechanisms relatively similar to how our brain works have also been suggested. In this sense, also using these query key values. In the sense that here these authors suggest that what would be memory, since it works with a system similar to what this type of key values database would be, where what is. The neocortex specializes in what would be the high-fidelity storage of information. That is, this information is super relevant and does not have to be modified. It has to be understood in its total context, and in order to access this type of information, we have to consult what would be the temporal lobe of the brain that allows us to access this information precisely. So in this case, what would be the limbic system, through some particular signals, accesses the information that is stored in the neocortex, and thus allows us to access the information from a particular memory. And if you want to see it as a specific example, maybe you could think about the Kokoro movie, where Mom Coco didn't remember practically her entire life, and it wasn't until Miguel, her grandson, played a song that he was able to access the entire set of memories that represented his upbringing with his father. That is to say, here what was the trigger was the key that represents the song and all the values, because it is precisely all the upbringing she had when she was a child. And this is how it is suggested, at least from a transformer architecture-based point of view, that this is how our brain might also work. And we can see how he has adapted too. What transformers are to the world of protein sequence modeling, we also have quite interesting aspects, which is what type of information these types of transformers are learning throughout their layers. And what we observe is that here are the layers of this transformer, and here, let's say that it is the capacity for detecting secondary structures, and that we see that in the first layers it is not being detected very well which residues would correspond to what type of secondary structure. Then in the intermediate layers of the model, it begins to be detected relatively well, and it is in the last layers where it begins to be detected or associated in a better way, which residue would correspond to what type of secondary structure. And this is quite interesting given that, during this modeling process, you are never given this type of secondary structure information. Rather, protein sequences are simply used, and the model, by mapping the contextual information of all the residues of all the proteins, learned a representation that is even capable of being associated with secondary structure patterns. And now, almost to finish, we move on to the part of what ADD is and normalization of what is the result of feed-forward. And this, as I mentioned, really has a function of stabilizing the gradients so that the information does not fade, and a more stable training can be achieved. Normalization really is not that complicated. Here, as you can see, it has two main components, and in this case, it is simply a projection and a scaling where it is almost like the normalizations with which we are already more accustomed. Which is, from a value, its average is extracted, and a quotient is made with what the variance is, or we could make an analogy with what would be a standard deviation, and then this result has to be multiplied or scaled in this case by different patterns that are also patterns learned by the model, and that therefore are also parameters that have to be learned in order to represent the information in a way that is faithful and rich in contextual information. What does this mean in geometric terms for the transformer and for the type of information it is modeling? And this is something that is explored in this particular preprint, where really the value of what normalization is not only in the fact that it can help training, but it also helps organize information in a geometric sense. What does this mean? When we train a transformer and specifically look at what happens in normalization, specifically in these two main sections, which is projection and scaling, we see the effect of projection. When we execute a normalization where this process is excluded from the projection, what we see is that here the keys and the vectors queries. They really do not have any apparent geometric information. They seem to be in a dispersed cloud that represents, let's say, disorganized information. But when we apply this type of normalization, it turns out that the geometric structure that is observed when mapping the quiz and queries vectors is already relatively more organized, which allows us to more easily access the type of information relationships that occur within these two types of vectors. This is the contribution of what would be the projection element in normalization, and in the part of what would be scaling, relatively interesting dynamics also occur. Here what we see is the number of vectors of these vectors, that is, how complex the information they are representing is. And what we observe is that the effect of scaling is that there will be cases where what the queries are will not be able to be selectable, and thus operate the attention process in a significant way, in such a way that this information is being lost during training. So in this gradient that we observe from 0 to 1, with 1, a high probability that these vectors are not selected to be able to perform the operation, and thus do not contribute to adding information to the entire model. What we observe is that even for phrases that are quite large, the queries are not selectable and could only be selectable when we talk about very short phrases, almost independently of the complexity of the dimension with which it is associated. But if we consider this part of the scaling in the normalization process, it now turns out that all the queries are selectable and therefore can contribute their information to the entire complex modeling of attention. You can access the information that each key constitutes and therefore learn increasingly interesting patterns. And this is really the contribution of this particular operation. That is, it allows the information to be organized in a richer way, such that this extraction can be done from all against all, and thus make a more interesting semantic mapping. And finally, we also come to something very curious, which is the original transformer architecture, as proposed, as you can see. It goes through this generation of the voltage query key values, then it is normalized, then it is passed with the residual connections, then again it goes with the feed forward, it is normalized again, and then it is interesting to turn to. See in what positions these normalizations are found. Because it was found that even when the preprint was published, and we all turned to see that this architecture could be very interesting, it was found that precisely if we first carried out the normalization, the gradients and the training process in general is much more stable. It converges faster to an optimal solution, and it was even named different types of transformer categories, which in this case, the original transformer was named post-LN. And once it was found that we can obtain better training by first positioning the normalization followed by the tension in the swift forward. These are known as pre-LN type transformers. This is just a curiosity that perhaps even when the developers of the attention is all you need article, perhaps they did not explore all the possible combinations of what would happen when we first execute normalization and then attention. This was something that was discovered recently. After having published the preprint, and which obviously comes from different authors, who are not those who originally developed the transformer. That is, there's room for optimization of this type of algorithms. So here we come to the end of what would be the explanation of the transformer architecture. And now, we are going to proceed to see a very quick representation of how all these calculations are executed that I already told you in detail, but now in brief form. Here consider that we obviously start from precisely one word, a phrase which is the card is blue. And then here all the query, key, values, positional encoding. Embeddings will have to be computed, go through the OPMACs, among many other things. As you can see, here are the query matrices. The OPMACs are calculated, and now we proceed to have the self-tension values. Afterwards, the self-tensioning procedure is completed. It is passed to the multi-heterotension. Everything is normalized. It is concatenated, and that is the information that is obtained by each head, and then that is represented by each of the encoders. This is because perhaps they can put it at a lower speed, so that they can press it in more detail and see how this entire procedure occurs, which really is practically thousands of operations, and which occur thanks to the speed of the GPUs, capable of parallelizing all these types of operations. So good. We return again to the concept of what language models are. And as I mentioned, language models based on transformer architectures have two large types in general terms, which are the generative models and the masked ones that are represented by these two architectures that are called green and GPT, which are variants of the transformer, in this case the green architecture, which in turn, the complete word, is bidirectional encoder representation from transformer. What it really does is specialize in the data masking procedure. So this is why it is called masked language modeling. And usually this task is associated with text representations that are rich in semantic information to be able to operate with them and thus perform clustering tasks of redaction dimension among other types of algorithms to explore the structure that these high-dimensional representations have. And the other type of transformer architecture that OJ has had is the GPT architecture, which by name is known as Generative Retrained Transformer, and in particular the way in which it is trained together with its loss function and other variables is different from what happens with BERT-type models, since in this case, we are talking about language modeling that is more causal, something that is also known as autoregressive. That is, in order to predict the next token, the information from all the tokens that preceded it must be used. And then use all your semantic contextual information to be able to come up with something that makes sense to predict. In that sense, being an autoregressive model because it allows you to extract all the semanticity in this way. 1. I need all the previous ones that preceded it. It is usually associated more with generative or modeling approaches precisely of text, which is precisely what Apple ChatGPT does. What we observe here is that really the BERT-type models or the GPT models, let's say, have specialized in the operations that occur in the encoder or the decoder, respectively. GPTs specialize more in the information that flows in the decoder and only use this particular module. And BERT-type models only use the encoder model since they focus on precisely representing the information in a rich way. Therefore, BERT-type models are usually used to be able to perform a posteriori tasks such as word classification, sentiment modeling, etc. And that there are multiple tasks that can be performed from information-rich representations, something we already explored in the deep learning class. And in the case of GPT-type models, which are autoregressive, by their nature they invite us to use them more as algorithms that are capable of generating text, that are like the interface that we are used to with ChatGPT. What we observe here is that these types of models really do specialize in their specific task. In this case, the BERT-type models, as you can see on the y-axis, are measured as their capacity or their performance in representing the embedding. And on the x-axis is its ability to be a generative model. So we have different types that are BERT-type models, such as that GPT, or different models that are autoregressive, such as Mistral, GPT-4, or GPT-J. What we observe is that precisely GPT-based architectures tend to have better performance in text generation tasks, but their embeddings really do not seem to be so good to be able to develop tasks later. They only serve inside the algorithm itself and thus make its predictions, but not for a posteriori tasks. Contrary to the case of BERT, which in this case BERT does not serve very well to be able to carry out these language generation tasks, such as the GPT chat interface, but they do generate representations rich in information that can help us carry out tasks a posteriori. As I already mentioned, it could be clustering, it could be dimensionality reduction, among many other things. This does not necessarily mean that they can be pigeonholed in their capabilities. For example, as seen with this preprint, that one can adapt other algorithms to BERT-type models, and that one can use them to now, let's put it this way, transform it into a generative capacity. It can be taken from this sphere to this other, and vice versa. However, these types of models, due to their training, due to their architecture, really specialize in quite specific concepts or tasks. Something interesting is that BERT. Well, it was a transformer that followed the attention is all you need paper, which was also developed by Google and which, as I mentioned, specializes precisely in generating information-rich representations. And from BERT, well, multiple more architectures emerged where we are really talking about a multiverse. Let's put it that way, which is called BERTology, where practically what there are variants of how attention is calculated. How? Normalization is calculated. And then we have variants of the BERT type transform, such as Ernie or Ernie value, Big BERT, and all of them with different variables. Perhaps now the most modern version of BERT that exists, and that perhaps you could take to perform analysis, is that you are interested in modeling text such as sentiment analysis or something in particular. It could be the transformer called Modern BERT, which practically recovers all the advances that have been made from 2017 to 2025, which is when this model was released, and which, well, uses all these advances to be able to retrain the original BERT architecture to have a more optimal model. And even if they want its version with multiple languages, they can use its variant called MMBERT, which not only models text in English, but, well, includes, well, another variety of languages in the case that, well, are interested in modeling something other than English. And for its part, GPT also had its own separate path, which also diversified quite considerably. Here what you see is an evolutionary tree of what the different types of architectures are, where we can see that there are some language models that could be considered the last common ancestors that these GPT or BERT models have. As I mentioned, some are specialized in the encoder, others are in the decoder. And here we can see the branch of BERT-type models, right? Here's BERT, and from BERT it diversified to others such as EARNY, DISTLBRT, Albert, Electra, DBRTA, etc. There's also another variant that has been less researched, which are language models based on both encoder and decoder. And perhaps the most researched variant here has been a transformer called T5. But in the branch of GPT-type models, which are based only on the decoder, it had greater interest, at least on the part of the research community. And this is mainly directed by the models trained by the company called OpenAI, which is the owner of ChatGPT, and which started with GPT-1, then with GPT-2, GPT-3, and from there things exploded to multiple GPT-type models, where we already have Jurassic, Lambda, Chinchilla, Bloom, Galactica. All of them are language models that some are specialized. For example, Galactica in scientific text modeling, others with different variants, etc. And GPT, what he proposed, or what he demonstrated to the community. It's a pretty interesting idea. As you can see here, the GPT-1 model had only 117 million parameters, represented by this white square. They later observed that by increasing the number of parameters, now in GPT-2, to 1.5 billion parameters. This blue square now scales to what would be the white box. And its performance with respect to GPT-1 in its text prediction modeling tasks improved considerably, but not to a term that would have been useful to us yet. So they decided to take it one step further. And then in GPT-3, they increased the number of parameters to 175 billion US, which served to show that his skills were becoming more sophisticated and that he could predict the text in an increasingly better way. Something that even took it now to GPT-4, where it no longer has billions of parameters. It now has American trillions, and then the language can be modeled even better by increasing the number of parameters of its GPT architecture. And obviously, consider other operations that help stabilize the training right. The relevant thing here is that, just one model like GPT-3 could be. We are talking about having approximately 96 layers, which represent approximately 10 million neurons. There is a lot of information. There are many parameters, and it is interesting how the prediction capabilities could be improved just by scaling the parameters. A dynamic that was perhaps mistakenly called scaling laws, which are not really laws. They are empirical observations, but they are quite consistent observations. What does this topic mean about what scaling laws are? In summary, it suggests that as we increase the complexity of the model through its parameters, its performance will improve and even unlock new abilities that were not really included at the beginning of this dynamic, of only predicting the most probable token in this dynamic. So, for example, what we observe here is that there is a language model called Palm, which has 8 billion parameters, and that at this dimension, or rather at this magnitude, it has language understanding capabilities, as could be expected, but it also has arithmetic and question answering capabilities. That's 8 billion, but when we increase the number of parameters in our model to 62 billion, we see that their language comprehension skills improve considerably along with others such as arithmetic and responses. But new skills also appear, such as translation or the ability to generate summaries. And this is quite interesting since even if we continue to increase the complexity of our model, now there are more capabilities than what our transformer can perform, in such a way that now we extract as semantic information, proverbs, capacities to be able to generate code. That is, it is already the capacity of a certain logic in this sense to be able to program code and be able to solve a task or even explain jokes, something that also requires a particular context to be explained. How do these escalation laws actually work? Here, for example, we are going to explore the scaling laws of the models trained by the company Meta, which are called Llama. In this case, we will use Llama 3 as an example, which are one of the most adopted models by the community. And what we observe here in this graph is the loss validation. In particular, that is, the tokens are also being precisely predicted with respect to the number of tokens that are being used to train these models. And here as color gradients is the number of parameters that were used to train those models. So what we observe is that for a specific number of parameters, such as this very faint gray or bluish line, multiple models were trained with different amounts of tokens or amounts of data, if you want to see it that way, in such a way that it seems to see that there is a particular optimum at this particular point here indicated by a purple diamond, where the model is already minimizing the loss, and that in this case it is already moving to this part of the overfitting of the model. It is already overfitting, and then it is no longer really learning. It is memorizing the data with which it was trained. And the same exercise is repeated for more and more parameters, as well as more and more data, which allows us to see a trend where there seems to be again that there is an optimum for each case that relates the task of language modeling to what would be the data set they are using and the complexity of the model seen from its number of parameters. So we can take all this information and fit something similar to a linear regression, more or less, so that it can help us predict to what number of tokens or how much information we need with respect to the amount of computational power that is needed to precisely model such an amount of data. We can now predict what computational power we require to model tens or thousands or tens of billions of data. Likewise, we can use metrics that help us see what is also being predicted by each of the words or tokens in particular, such as this metric called the negative log likelihood, in this case represented here, and again on the y-axis and on the x-axis. Again, we observe what the computability capacity that we count is. So what we observe is that a particular token is also being predicted. It also goes hand in hand with the computing capabilities they have. Then again, we can fit another regression to be able to relate these two variables and thus predict if we scale the model to, I don't know, 400 billion parameters, what amount of computation, what amount of data do we need to reach equality of predicting the next most probable, most adequate token. Something that is more or less seen precisely in this new graph, where what they use is all the data that we learned precisely from the Llama models, along with those that were learned in the Llama 2 version. And then we see that the better the language predicts, its prediction capabilities are also improved. And then we can adjust a model that is made up of many millions of parameters, and that helps us optimize in terms of computational resources and datasets that we need to connect in order to train this specific model. Scaling laws were something that, in fact, the OpenAI laboratory found when it explored the GPT-3 architecture, where again we see this type of graphs, where the validation loss is found along with the computing capacity. And then, again, models are trained with different numbers of parameters. And we observe again that trend that we usually adjust a better loss validation to models with a greater number of parameters. And this goes hand in hand with the computing capacity to be able to model the language. And these abilities to predict the next token are also reflected in a better understanding, in terms of mathematics and even video generation or text compression, of the relationship between text and images. So we can say that in general terms the capacities are improving, as we saw in this video of the little trees, where new capacities of this type of models appeared each time. And the relevant thing about making this type of graphs is that we can precisely derive a formula which relates the lost function, the parameters, and the amount of data necessary to be able to fit a model of X complexity that is usually associated with this other formula, which are normal parameters that are obtained by adjusting this type of regressions, and that is also considered a variable that is the irreducible entropy of the text, which can no longer be minimized. It is an intrinsic error that these models have due to their probabilistic nature, but we can minimize this error, this entropy, by considering all these other parameters and thus precisely designing training that does not make us waste our computational resources, and that helps us detect what amount of data we need to be able to train a model with X number of specific parameters. This is a super interesting dynamic that was even widely adopted by practically the entire community within the world of transformers or language models, where really what we saw is that the computing capacities used to train the frontier models were growing almost at a rate of 4 to 5 times per year, and that even the size of the data set that was used to train this type of algorithms also grew at a rate of approximately 4 times per year since 2010, something that we can see precisely in this type of graphs that relates to us. The computing capacity with respect to the year of publication, and each little point of them, is one of the models that have been currently coming out. We therefore have precisely key models, such as AlexNet, which demonstrated precisely that deep learning could be a solution to multiple problems in a super efficient way. Later, other very relevant ones, such as GPT-3, which demonstrated precisely these scaling laws. And then we take it to almost absurd things, such as GPT-4, Grok 4, Gemini Ultra, each time training larger and larger models, right? And then we move on to the different stages that they have precisely during this training process. As we previously explored, this type of GPS language models obviously use text as input, although, well, now you know that they can use multiple data modalities, and let's say now, adapting to what would be how BERT-type models work, we can use explain that it is simply a masking of the data, and then by hiding this information, the model is forced to learn representations of the information rich in contextual information, such that it can be able to say which words are most likely to fall into these parts that had been previously masked. And these predictions are now going to have to be measured by how good they were using a particular loss function. This is the general process that every language model must follow, and which is known as pre-training. In the event that it is an autoregressive type model, then obviously it will not be a Muscat law, but rather it will be a causal law, an autoregressive one, and it will only be the predictions based on the information of the previous states. However, it has now diversified as the different training stages that these types of algorithms have, where now we no longer only have the pre-training phase, but now we have the post-training phase, which basically would be like an adjustment of the model to be able to improve its capabilities each time. So let's say that having trained a language model, we train it on a super general data corpus, and we want him to specialize in topics, for example in biology, so that we may be able to answer questions associated with this particular topic. Then what is known as fine-tuning of this model is carried out, an adjustment of the parameter values by showing them only a set of information related to the area that interests us in particular, such as in this case biology, and then improving its predictive capabilities on this specific topic. You can see fine-tuning in this case as the entire chain of most probable tokens to follow, and then, being a general model, really the space or probability distribution that could follow in a language model is represented by this entire sketch of black lines. But when performing fine-tuning, what we do is limit the probability distribution of possible solutions that the transformer can access by modeling what the probable token is next most probable, and then, by delimiting this probability distribution, giving us answers that could be more appropriate to the questions we are asking about a specific topic. The aspect here is that what is the fine-tuning of this type of language models is also carried out through different substages, where fine-tunings are found to instruct the type of actions it has to do, to associate some preference that perhaps we like the way it responds to us more when it uses emojis than when it does not use emojis, or even fine-tuning can be done to instill certain symbolic reasoning capabilities in this model so that it is capable of, let's call it that, reflect, although it is not really reflecting, regarding its own responses and what values if they are really correct or incorrect. And I personally like to represent this with this Lovecraftian monster, which is the idea of an alignment. That is, all the procedures that have to be done during the training of a language model so that it can be useful to us in practical terms as people. When we train a language model with all the amount of data that was used, we are talking about a monster, a horrible amount of information, but also of horrible information that we can find in the data present on the internet. As you know, the internet is not the most prosperous environment for cordial interaction between people, where they consider many vices that humanity has, such as misogyny, misandry, classism, racism, and many more types of discrimination against any type of social group. And then here we have an example of, for example, How do these types of language models associate a text string with what an image would be? What plausibility does he give when asked what this image represents? So, for example, when we ask a model called clip, in this sense, it gives us a probability of 0.27 that this photograph of an astronaut, which is Dr. Collins. In this case, this probability of 0.27 is indicating that she is indeed the astronaut that Dr. Collins is. And as you can see, this probability is lower than the probability that occurs when she is given a text string indicating that she is not an astronaut, but that she is a housewife with a rather ornate orange suit, but which has practically nothing to do with Dr. Collins' professional training. And these were patterns that were learned, given that these patterns are actually inserted in the data set with which these types of models were trained. So that is why this figure of a Lovecraftian monster is born, because in reality it has to be trained with this type of information that can be so detestable, but which is the information we have. So yes, you can learn interesting relationships in the text. But we now have to instill in the model that these are not really desirable responses, since they do not reflect the reality of our world. And so now we have to move on to a second stage of training, which in this case is a supervised fine-tuning, where it is now represented by this machine, this human mask, where it now serves as a technological interface. Well, precisely human of our interactions, where we can instill in him, let's go like this, or point out that these types of responses are not desired, but we can also instruct him how to interact in a dynamic where two people are having a conversation and one asks a question, then the other has to answer, and then the other can ask the same question, and then the first now has to answer the second person's question. That is, at this stage you are now. It shows how the interactions desired by us people would be, which is known as the instruction tuning phase, and now as the last phase we have an interface here represented by a happy face, that is now taken by this human interface where what it does to us is how to represent the preferences that we have for multiple responses that a language model could give us. This is usually seen when we are using ChatGPT, and for a question we ask, it usually gives us two answers, and now we have to select which of those two answers we like more, whether because it is shorter or has more information, whether or not it uses emojis or the information is completely wrong. In this case, by selecting with a click which we like best, we are telling the model that we don't. We precisely prefer that particular way of modeling all the probability distributions that led to generating that response, and then it can be used to improve precisely the modeling that occurs within this type of algorithms. So, as you can see, there are really multiple stages that start from super crude models of information. They go specializing more in a human interaction, until we arrive at precisely something that pleases us as an acceptable answer to a question that we have asked. And really this ability to give us an answer that is humanly acceptable is not free, so to speak. It really comes from the work of many very poorly paid workers, usually from developing countries, which is quite well documented in this interview conducted by one of the researchers from the Google DeepMind laboratory, called Hannah Fry, with a content moderator named James. He is a man who lives in the country of Kenya and who precisely works in selecting this type of content that is detestable and therefore remove it from the type of data with which these language models are trained. And then in one of the questions that Hannah asks James about whether this was an activity that was traumatic, James actually answers yes, that he actually suffers from post-traumatic stress and insomnia, such that it even led him to change the perception that he has of society, another that is completely different from the one we have, since he observed thousands of human basenesses when reviewing a lot of content on the internet with which these types of algorithms are trained, and that even this can be valued as a kind of digital colonialism by the large companies that train these algorithms and sell them as a product in themselves. This task of filtering content and selecting what does and does not happen is really extremely poorly paid, such that they only receive approximately $200 a month, and they are not really offered psychological support to be able to deal with all the content they have to handle. Something that really leads to effects such as these post-traumatic stress responses and insomnia. And it is really something quite detestable to know when you review that these types of benefits that we have from using ChatGPT also come from the misfortunes that other people have to go through to be able to reach this level of product. Through outsourcing exercises and other types of economic mechanisms that companies use to be able to spend as little as possible on these types of aspects. This is important to know for familiarize ourselves and not think that this type of language models really have as a consciousness. But now, we already know that it is a whole series of training that makes the answers they give us really resemble an answer that we consider acceptable in multiple aspects of both the human aspect and the topic that we are making the assessment. So now we move on to another topic that is regarding how the current models are operating. And this comes from a talk given by one of the founders of the OpenAI lab called Ilya Sutskever, which states that this pre-training phase really proved to be effective in terms of scaling. Every time we trained larger models, the capabilities of these models were improved. And the big problem with this task is that the data is not really growing at the same rate at which the models we are training are growing. So we are running into a limitation, which in that sense he makes an analogy that really the data that we can extract from the internet can be seen in a way like the fossil fuel of these artificial intelligence engines, such that we know that the future is in renewable energies that pollute less and are more sustainable to execute. But in this case, we are limited given that it is really what we have most easily available, just as the data that is on the internet is really what we have even greater access to our sense. Then we have to explore new strategies to get data, because we have already run out of data. Something that we can see in these estimates that suggest that really all that data that we as humanity have generated really approximates that we could have spent it between the years 2026 to 2032, and that there will no longer be any other place where we can derive all this information that is relatively useful to be able to train our language models. And here, what we observe. On the y-axis, it is precisely the size of the datasets measured as the number of tokens with respect to years. And then we see certain trends regarding the amount of data and years with which new models emerge. And we find this trend that we increasingly train larger models. And it seems that when adjusting a regression so that they can model this dynamic, we are approaching precisely the limit of the growth, or rate, that data on the internet is experiencing. And precisely with this extrapolation, we can observe that models that are expected to focus on this interval of years would already be using all the data even though they are growing, but obviously not. They do so at a considerably slower rate compared to the computational capabilities that we are developing through the development of large data centers. So it is clear that we have to find other strategies that are not simply scaling, as GPT-3 really explored at its beginning, which saw that by scaling precisely we found better performances, given that at that moment precisely The language models that existed at that time really dedicated a large amount of training to this phase, which is known as pre-training. And only less than half dedicated themselves to what post-training is, and a minimum of what is the inference process of giving an answer to a question. And then we turn to see something that's like a rule of thumb based on empirical observations that have been recorded over years of research, which is that there are two techniques or approaches that have been shown to be capable of improving as computational capabilities also improve, which are learning and search tasks. In this sense, as we can see in the pre-training part, what is happening is learning. But then now we believe that we have another branch in which we can invest our resources to be able to improve this type of algorithms, which is the search, or in other words, the inference of what would be an answer to a particular question. That this is the phase where modern language models have now dedicated a large part of the computing capacity to be able to improve the capabilities of the models, and this. It really comes from an idea that Richard Sutton proposed, who is one of the fathers of the reinforcement learning strategy, which suggests that in general terms, the algorithms, the most effective methods that he has observed throughout his entire professional career, are those that are like general purpose, generalist, that these that are generalist, if they go hand in hand with this increase in computing with respect to its performance, such that then it is only these two types of tasks, search and learning, that do seem to go hand in hand as we scale computing capabilities, a lesson which he called the bitter lesson. Given that many of the algorithms that we have developed throughout the history of humanity seek to include adequate knowledge to be able to include the largest inductive biases that really allow us to obtain predictions that are appropriate for the object of study in question. So, for example, we're talking about the AlphaFold architecture actually including quite a few inductive biases that integrate evolutionary information, that integrate chemical and physical information of the proteins in order to make its predictions. And when we look at how the AlphaFold 3 algorithm occurs, we see that many of those strategies that were applied, many of those inductive biases, were discarded in favor of an algorithm that is relatively more generalist compared to that implemented in AlphaVos 2. An example that can illustrate precisely this idea that more generalist methods, which are more focused on search and learning tasks, they are those that seem to be really predominating in terms of performance compared to those that we as humanity make in a relatively more artisanal way. So, this is where the whole world of reinforcement learning comes in as a star. And to do this, you have to understand how this type of algorithms occur. So, first we have to focus on what any type of task would be. In this case, we're going to illustrate it by performing a phylogenetic analysis, and thus finding the evolutionary relationships between protein sequences, or even between genomes of different species. It is already done in this case, since many bacteria, archaea, and humans represent the tree of life. In order to do this type of phylogenetic analysis, as you may already know, you must first obviously collect all the sequences from multiple databases. We have to do a cleaning process of duplication and a lot of data processing and cleaning to have good quality sequences. Subsequently, we have to choose a sequence alignment algorithm to be able to check and see which regions would be more conserved compared to others, and then generate these small blocks of conserved residues and other regions that are separated by what we know as gaps. Later, once we have an alignment, well, we choose some method or some evolutionary model that allows us to construct in a relatively plausible way how evolution occurred in this set of sequences. And later now, we do the phylogenetic inference with a program such as IQtree, FastTree, or RaxML. There are multiple programs to build phylogenies. Finally, the result that an evolutionary tree of phylogeny will give us is precisely. Well, now we have to evaluate each of its nodes, each of the branches, how credible, how plausible it is, right? Evaluate whether they are good predictions in this sense, a good modeling of these evolutionary dynamics. And finally now, we have to do a whole process of integrating all the results to be able to visualize the tree and get results from there, and obviously find, well, some narrative that coincides with evidence that we have observed in multiple ways. All of these are tasks that have to be fulfilled in order to carry out a phylogenetic analysis, and in each of them there are many other options that can be taken to be able to solve them. So they take into account that any type of analysis can really be subdivided into submodules, and each one with a lot of diversity, and this is precisely what is being intended with reinforcement learning algorithms. In this case, adapting a dynamic where language models now function as something known as agents, which are algorithms capable of carrying out actions, of evidently making their decisions and evaluating that they are also being executed. With respect to some metric, with respect to something in particular that indicates to them that it is working. In this case, our agent is going to be a language model, and this language model is going to perform some action, such as some set within one of these tasks that we already reviewed. Choose one of the many programs, for example, aligners that exist. And then, this action will result in what an environment is. And this environment, depending on whether that action was really good or bad, will reward the agent, regarding whether it was useful to exercise that particular action in order to solve the task that has been instructed. So the agent has now received a reward, a stimulus, and the state of the entire system changes. It is updated in such a way that now the agent must be able to choose what is the next action to take in order to continue with this particular task, which was already illustrated with what would be, for example, a phylogenetic analysis. And during this procedure, what the agent does, the language model, is learn what is known as a training policy, which is specifically this idea that you have to define a strategy of what actions to take in order to solve a specific task. In this case, let's say there are multiple actions you can take within each of these modules, and then let's say the combination of action 1 with action 33 and action 222. It turned out to be the most optimal to be able to solve the task that was instructed to the language model, or to people in this sense, given that it is now capable of executing its own analyses. In that sense, it is now known as people. And this is precisely what has been the current paradigm with which these types of language models are being executed. And really, reinforcement learning has proven to be extremely useful when it is well executed with, therefore, a fairly good scrutiny, with the training that this type of models require, which is quite well illustrated with what was the development by the DeepMind laboratory with its model, called AlphaGo Zero, a model based on effortful learning which learned to play this game that is, let's say, similar to chess but is much more complicated than it is called Go. In this case, the algorithm learned to play precisely this game that we as humans develop autonomously, playing against itself, and in each of these iterations, evidently refining the actions it can take to know which play is really more effective in winning the game of Go. So even when they put this model, based on reinforcement learning, called AlphaGo Zero, into competition, defeated the previous algorithm that was the best, that was simply called AlphaGo, and AlphaGo is an algorithm that was trained with the plays it had with multiple champions in the world of Go, among them a guy called Lee Sedol, and that even DeepMind dedicated an entire documentary to it that became extremely famous, where what AlphaGo is demonstrated a certain degree of creativity because he played a move which has already gone down in history, which is known as Move 37, which turned out to be extremely unlikely to be executed. And even when AlphaGo decided to make this move, it surprised both Lystal and many of those who were watching the game to such an extent that even Lystal had to go out to smoke a cigarette and think about what happened and how. Giving his next role in the game, because it was relatively surprising to the point that even in a later interview, this same Lystal acknowledged that this movement really represented to him that AlphaGo really was a creative algorithm and that it made him rethink things about how he played Go right. One thing that is quite interesting is that even when we begin to evaluate what effects the development of AlphaGo and AlphaGo Zero had on creativity, the quality of the decisions that Go players make from what they can extract during games. They play against this artificial intelligence. It is seen that the decisions made by human players have improved, thanks to artificial intelligence, which is precisely what we see in this graph that is on the yes axis, a metric that was designed in this particular article, which is precisely how good a move is in this game of Go in relation to what the years would be. And precisely what we observe is that when the AlphaGo algorithm appears, humans, we, have learned more and more creative, innovative, and interesting plays that precisely improve the probability of being able to win a particular game of Go. That is to say, this AI really encouraged or promoted us as humans to break with the traditional paradigms that we had and explore new routes that could be interesting in order to win a game of Go, which is expected to also have similar implications in its multiple other applications within science in general, as has now happened with AlphaFold. Something interesting is also the way in which it has happened, the way in which we have trained this type of algorithms, given that, as we already reviewed in the machine learning and deep learning class, we as people actually demonstrated a set of data labeled with an algorithm that in this case could be like our student and here represented by a little robot so that it can make predictions that are useful to us. And that is the traditional way with which we have guided ourselves, until then and currently now with techniques based on language, models in transformer-type architectures, and together with other alignment techniques, such as this could be this which is reinforcement learning derived from human feedback. Now we have great language models, which we teach them to mimic the behaviors that we as humans have, such that then the answers that these models give will be of our degree, either in a sense of humanity, we will call it that, but also to resolve the question with which we are coming to you. And currently there are even new paradigms, which are known as distillation, where it is no longer us who are teaching them the algorithms, but rather the algorithms themselves are teaching each other. So that, for example, we can have an algorithm that in this case is considered a supervisor and which instructs a model what it is going to do, what type of actions to perform, how to address the data, among many other things. And this model can be considered as the student. So that even now we have arrived to paradigms where large language models such as GPT-4, Gemini Trace, among others, can transfer all that knowledge, all those statistical patterns that they have learned from observing enormous amounts of data, and then, let's say, a kind of distillate of this data is obtained, such that a model with a smaller number of parameters can simulate you. These statistical patterns that were learned through this learning distillation process, through techniques based on reinforcement learning algorithms, such as those called DPO, PPO, and many others that are really exploding right now in Research in current terms. What we observe here is practically how one of the modern language models is trained. So what we observe is that an algorithm, a language model, does not really have a good response to some input that we give, such as a greeting, since the model is not trained, since it has not gone through this pre-training phase. So once this phase is carried out, the model now learns to give us responses that are relatively more consistent with the input we are giving. And then this is where all the phases that we reviewed previously come in, which would be the instruction fine-tuning or the preference fine-tuning, where we are going to teach it to behave in such a way that it is like a chat interface, that it is capable of responding or attending to answers, asking questions, and multiple other things typical of an interaction between two people. And that even responses that are not of greater preference to us as humans, as in this case that you are being asked what flavor of ice cream you should buy, and in this case perhaps many voted for chocolate because the chocolate flavor is a flavor. Let's say it is globally accepted, and precisely in this phase where what is the fight? Joining by preference, or the fight joining by renunciation occurs. Reasoning is where effortful learning algorithms are being executed to be able to learn this type of things. We see that what currently exists as a frontier strategy is to instill in it, let's call it this, a certain form of symbolic reasoning such that then the algorithm becomes capable of reflecting on its responses and, well, relate all of them and detect which one would be the most appropriate for the question we are asking. In order to learn more about this type of things in an extremely didactic way, I personally recommend that you check out Julia's channel on YouTube, who is a researcher who also makes a beautiful dissemination web with which I have learned a lot and from which precisely this image comes, so that you can access precisely to quite complex topics, but in a much simpler and easily interpretable way for those of us who perhaps do not have training in the area of computer sciences. So now what we see is that the current frontier is based on this idea that algorithms are capable of reasoning. And we can effectively say that if they are, algorithms can effectively carry out a type of reasoning that is symbolic reasoning. But this reasoning is considerably different by miles, miles away from the phenomenological reasoning that occurs with us as humans who use multiple mechanisms to reach reflection. In this case, they are a symbolic reasoning that is, well, a minimalist version of this phenomenological capacity, and that really in terms of algorithms, reasoning can be understood as the ability to generate a sequence of intermediate tokens before being able to produce a final response, which is represented by these capacities of a reasoning language model called DeepSeq, which was launched by a company in China. And here what we can see are all these chains of thoughts that the language model has had when faced with a particular question related to mathematics. So what we see is that the language model is, in that sense, reasoning in quotes, exploring the multiple responses that it gives itself, and that then in one of those responses in particular, it points out, wait. This is my aha moment or my eureka moment, where I have to focus and pay more attention to be able to see those small details that could perhaps help give a better answer to the question that the user asked me. So what you see is that the algorithm is exploring its own answers and is learning to evaluate the quality of these answers to give us a better answer. In the end, a conclusive one in this sense. And obviously, DeepSeq achieved these reasoning capabilities in a particular way, but it's not like there is just one. In fact, let's say that we can catalog multiple algorithms that can generally be classified into 4 broad categories that can be executed in order to obtain this idea of a model capable of reasoning. One would be precisely the escalation during the inference of a response. Another would be to achieve reasoning through direct, raw reinforcement learning techniques and nothing else. Or you can do it through supervised fine-tuning or reinforcement learning, a combination of these two, or the distillation methods that we saw previously. In general, when we review combos that a modern language algorithm was trained, it may be that it is classified among these four large categories in order to reach these levels of symbolic reasoning. Well, now we move on to review how these models, especially the reasoning models, are able to perform their tasks, and if they are really useful in generalizing to data with which they have not been used in training, which is also relatively difficult to assess given that no person outside of these companies like Google, Meta, etc. It really has access to the data with which these models were trained, and therefore we have to blindly trust that they were trained with good quality data. That is something that has also been like a secret within the community. And in general, what we can observe in this new image is the capabilities that the algorithms have had. In multiple tasks that we associated with human abilities, such as reading comprehension, image recognition, language comprehension, digit recognition, being able to speak or perform predictive reasoning. And really all the algorithms that were practically before what the Transformers architecture was, had a performance that was relatively bad, when we consider what the current performance would be. Typical of an average human, and that just when the Transformer architecture appeared in approximately 2017, they really considerably improved all these capabilities in these multiple tasks. Only perhaps the only one that had already made considerable progress would be image recognition using the architecture of convolutional relenderanos. But until the appearance of Transformer architecture, was that all these tasks had a boom, and that even as we can see here what predictive reasoning would be, now it would already be in this other part of the diagram, where they already have a relatively good performance with respect to the capabilities of an average human. Something that has also been relatively poorly commutized, perhaps even sold like smoke, something that we will explore in more detail below. Here what we observe is the performance that these language models have had, compared to reasoning language models, by looking at their performance on a particular benchmark called AM2425. So what we observe is this performance on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, what we observe is time and multiple models represented by dots. And what we observe is that precisely the models that are not reasoners have a deplorable performance, but until these models with reasoning capabilities appeared. Yes, a great advance was really achieved, at least in this particular benchmark, in this series of tests that represents the AIME set. But this does not necessarily mean that reasoning models are extremely good for any task, as in this case is also investigated in another publication, where multiple puzzles are proposed, multiple puzzles, let's call them that in this case. It is one that they designed called Zebra. And then here we observe precisely different reasoning models, and what we observe is that they are also achieving the power to complete this task, which is to solve this puzzle regarding how many reasoning tokens these models are really investing. And what we observe is that for some tasks in general, they always end up, as we are going to say, overthinking. We are also going to say it like this. Well, not specifying the task, since they go back and forth on the same issue and are not able to reach a solution and go with each token they invest, deteriorating their modeling capabilities. Which also tells us that not everything can be addressed through these reasoning techniques. One of the most famous benchmarks that exist today to be able to precisely evaluate the capabilities of reasoning models is this benchmark called RKGI, which is practically like this type of psychometric analysis that they do to us in admission exams, where they ask what the state of the next image is based on previous states, which perhaps we as people can derive more easily, but obviously a language model needs multiple mechanisms to be able to detect certain patterns that could help predict what the state of the next configuration would be. And again, what we observe is that this particular benchmark is being solved, something that was previously considered extremely difficult, but that the models are also investing money in this inference time, which is enormous. We are talking about the fact that in order to come up with a pretty good solution like the Gemini 3 Deep Think, they are spending around $100 per task. Then there are multiple tasks that they have to solve in order to establish what would be the next state of the images. And then we are talking about that even solving one task is costing these companies about $10,000, which is evidently economically viable for what would be the development of these models in production in real terms. So it is then offered as this particular strip as a solution that is economically viable to be able to solve. Well, tasks in the real world here also what we observe is multiple benchmarks, each associated with questions from multiple areas of science, in programming mathematics competitions among many other things. And what we observe is that until recently, with what was the appearance of reasoning models, they have been improved to a point that, well, practically, well, they are no longer useful for us to be able to detect which model has the best performance, given that now all the reasoning models, it turns out that they all have relatively equivalent performance between them. They are pretty good overall. Something that is now known as benchmark saturation, since they no longer offer us useful information to discern which would be better compared to another model. And this has led to the idea on the part of many people who are considered techno-optimists, due to the fact that then perhaps something may arise that is known as a superintelligence, a general artificial intelligence capable of carrying out all the intellectual human activities that we can develop, but that will now be developed by an algorithm, a language model, and then, for example in this case, one of these characters such as Leopold could be. What it suggests is that even this type of general artificial intelligence, or even one that already has capabilities similar to those that an engineer or a researcher, a scientist, could have, could appear precisely between approximately the years 2027-2028. However, we must consider at least this other side of this panorama, which is that, really, when you are on an exponential line, everything really seems like it is growing exponentially, right? When in reality it may be that you run into a wall in this sigmoid curve, where there is no longer going to be an improvement, but given that you are precisely in this incremental phase of performance, you think that this performance is going to be extrapolated almost indefinitely, and that then we will be able to, well, unlock this general artificial intelligence or superintelligence, right? Something that was precisely suggested that even GPT-5 was going to achieve, that even its developers themselves spoke with this analogy, that if GPT-3 was a little fish, then GPT-4 was an orca in the sea, right? And that now GPT-4 or GPT-5 was going to represent a leap of this magnitude, where now GPT-5 was a blue whale, one of the largest animals in the marine world. And even when it came out and the community began to test its features, its abilities, it was relatively disappointed because it was not demonstrated that when scaling models to an extremely large scale, in practical terms, it will result in better responses for the user when faced with multiple tasks. This has led to a problem known as the leaderboard illusion, where what happens is that these types of laboratories really focus on being able to achieve or solve this type of benchmarks, rather than actually improving the modeling capabilities of their artificial intelligences. So if this then becomes the metric, it really stops being something useful to be able to compare between models, given that their performance is being artificially evaluated. And this is something that unfortunately has been recently reflected with the practices carried out by Meta. And not only Meta, but multiple laboratories such as OpenAI, Anthropic, and even others. Where, for example, what we see here is that when Meta launched its Yamaha 4 model, it evidently sold that it was efficient in multiple benchmarks, as you can see here represented in multiple color bars in each of the different tasks. And then when the model was launched, it was suggested that it had very high capabilities, as we can see here in the yes axis, where its metric is measured in particular to each benchmark, however. And thanks to the fact that this model was open source, that is, the community was able to download the model to be able to use and evaluate it on their personal machines, it was found that these statistics were actually inflated and that its performance would even be equivalent to what would be the performance of its previous version, which would be the Yamaha 3 model. That is, the developers of Meta. They lied about their original performance in order to make some noise in the market and draw attention to the launch of their new model, and for it to be more widely adapted by the community, whether research or deployment of products based on artificial intelligence. And this really represents a crisis in how we manage benchmarks. This crisis is mainly present in the world of the biomedical area, where we really do not have what would be standard benchmarks, such as those that are aimed at evaluating text-language models in general terms. In this case, we also do not have a consensus on what metrics could be useful to assess performance in biomedical tasks, nor do we have validation protocols or gold standards regarding the datasets that we can use to train and use as a reference. And we're going to explore this with several examples. In this particular case, we are going to, let's say, explore the task of being able to classify whether or not a patient is likely to have pneumonia based on X-rays of their physiognomy. And so here we see one particular graph. On the y-axis, what we see is a binary classification metric called ROC, which in summary tells us that it is also detecting positive or negative cases of pneumonia. The presence of pneumonia, with values close to 0.5 predicting that are completely random, that is, our classifier is bad, and values close to 1 reflect that they are capable of detecting cases that are positive or negative. And on the x-axis, what we see is a relative rate of pneumonia between two hospitals, such that values close to 1 represent a neutral rate in being able to detect pneumonia. Between two hospitals that are this one called the Mount Sinai, and the other one that is the National Institute of Health, and then values that are relatively associated with very small values, such as all those that are pulled to the left represent a higher prevalence in what is pneumonia in cases of the National Institute of Health Hospital, or what can be interpreted in the same way as a lower prevalence in what would be the Mount Sinai Hospital. And otherwise, the values that are further to the right with respect to this axis, which is 1, mean that there are greater cases of pneumonia present at the Mount Sinai Hospital. And then, in general terms, what we observe is that this classifier of whether or not pneumonia exists from X-ray plates, since, in the case where there is a greater prevalence than the data from the National Institute of Health, well, they really can be relatively well classified. They have an ROC of approximately 0.8, which tells us that they are good classifications. And as we reach a neutral rate, these classification capabilities decline. And similarly, now when we go to what is the highest prevalence in the MSH hospital, we once again find that this capacity of the classifier increases in being able to detect cases effectively, and that even here the authors give us a gray bar where they show us what would be the real distribution that is observed in the data that they use to train their classifiers. So first, what we observe in this dynamic is the fact that there is an imbalance of data in such a way that, well, this classifier tends to precisely detect the presence of pneumonia from X-ray films based on the data with which it was trained, evidently using data from these two hospitals. So what would happen when we explore data that does not come from these two hospitals, But now we assess what this classifier is also when generalizing to data that is from a new hospital, which in this case is Indiana University Hospital. And now what we see is that this relative rate of detecting whether there is pneumonia or not, well, it decays to rock values of approximately 0.7 in general terms. As you can see here, we draw a line, and most of the cases in this case, it decays, which tells us that it is almost tending to make predictions randomly. And it is evident then that including data that was not recorded during training, it is not capable of detecting patterns or statistics that can be used to make its predictions. And what does this due to? Well, for example, the variability that exists in being able to capture, which also integrate variability in the data. And that would not really be modeled in the first training that only used data from two hospitals, and that when extrapolating them to other variables that we do not know that were captured during the performance of they. Do not generalize this system in this case, since the biases are contained in the training data. As a second example, we have this ability that has been sold from reasoning models in their abilities to detect some diseases based on some clinical history that is presented to them. In this sense, this study asks if reasoning models are really capable of reasoning in medical terms, or if what they are doing is extracting statistical patterns present in the data in the text that is being given, which is the clinical history, and from them the inference is then being made. So there are two paths: a reasoning that is based on medical bases, and another that exploits the statistical patterns of the text. And then what they did is take